everyone, my name is Eric. Welcome to my capstone presentation. Today we're going to be discussing decreasing the sugar intake in the adolescent population. So welcome and let's get started. Alright, so to start things off, the first thing I'd like is if you guys can go ahead and pause the video here in a second and follow this link. I'll also put it in the comments below. So it's easy for you to just copy and paste into your browser. It's just a survey that I made that's 6 or 7 questions long. It'll take you about a minute to take. At the end, I'll ask you to do a separate one that'll actually, it's very similar but slightly different. And the information that I get from this one and the one at the end will help me tremendously in compiling data about the population that I chose, which is you guys as parents and guardians of adolescents, in order to complete my capstone project. So if you could pause the video now and take that survey real quick, I'll be waiting here. All right, thank you for taking that survey real quick. Hopefully it wasn't too grueling for you. Before I get started with the meat of the presentation, I just have to start with a disclaimer. The information that I have provided for this presentation, I compiled from a variety of sources, some peer-reviewed, some not. All of the citations are in text in the slide as well as the end, so you can go and look at any of the information that I provided at your leisure. The information that I am providing is not medical advice. I am only a student, so it is not medical advice. If you want any more information, then I'd like if you could consult your primary care provider. They can help you with anything that would be decisions in making changes in your life or your adolescents' lives. And then lastly, the points that I present do not necessarily reflect those of my educational institution, South University, and the institution does not assume any responsibility for the information presented. So now just a little bit about myself, because I think that it gives some background as to why I chose this topic and why this topic is important to me. So I grew up in northern Colorado playing a variety of sports all my life. Sports have always played a huge role in my childhood and really how I came to be a PA student. Once I graduated from high school, I attended Colorado State University, where I got my Bachelor's of Science in Health and Exercise Science and a concentration in sports medicine. So all the way through my undergrad, I kind of just built on my knowledge of nutrition, and it became more near and dear to my heart. And that led me to pursuing a career as a physician assistant. So I actually moved to South Florida to attend South University here in West Palm Beach, and I'm currently in my 2nd year there. So I kind of already mentioned the beginnings of why I chose the PA, but I just really wanted to touch on why I chose the PA profession here really quickly before we get started with decreasing sugar intake for the adolescents. So what I really love about being a PA is the ability to make a difference in my patients' lives. So the PA platform is kind of built on bringing affordable healthcare to patients who might not otherwise have access. So a lot of PAs work in rural areas or serving underserved populations who would otherwise not be able to get it. And something that PA school's really done an amazing job of is emphasizing patient interactions and empathy. So not just treating the disease, but treating the patient, remembering that my patients are human, and just really kind of being an overall good provider and not just looking at patients as patient cases, but as humans who need our help, and just making sure that we treat them with kindness. Also, PAs work in virtually any field of medicine, so anything from doing emergency medicine to actually flight medicine, which is kind of cool, so you can be on a helicopter or airplane, primary care, dermatology, all of those. So it just gives a really good career path because I can choose anything that piques my interest at any time. And then also with that, we're still able to diagnose and treat patients. So I'm able to see my own patients. I make their diagnosis. I'm allowed to prescribe medications. Obviously, once I'm not a student anymore, I'm a certified PA, but I think that that's really great because it allows me to take care of my patients from step one all the way to the end and see their treatment through, and really lets me bond with my patients and treat them to the best of my abilities. All right, so let's get started with the meat of the presentation. So for our capstone project, my faculty requested that we chose something from Healthy People 2030, which if you don't know about Healthy People 2030, they had a Healthy People 2020 and now they moved it to 2030. It's a nationwide effort in order to find health issues and build upon them to help build our country into a healthier population. It ranges anything from prenatal care to nutrition style topics like I chose to preventative medicine. So some of the goals straight from Healthy People 2030, they want to attain healthy, thriving lives and well-being free of preventable disease, disability, injury, and premature death. They want to eliminate health disparities, achieve health equity, and attain health literacy to improve the health and well-being of all, and promote healthy development, healthy behaviors, and well-being across all life stages. So those are just kind of their pillars of their goals, and the overarching goal being that they just want to build a healthier country, healthier people. And my presentation really focuses on the third goal as far as promoting healthy development, healthy behaviors, and well-being across the life stages. Because if we can start early with changing our dietary habits as an adolescent, it makes it that much easier for us to continue those dietary habits later on into life, and just give us a good foundation to be healthy and have a good, healthy life. So now that we know about the goals of Healthy People 2030, I just wanted to throw in the methods that they use. I'm not going to read these word for word because they're a little bit long. Basically, though, Healthy People says that they set national goals and found ways in order to measure them so that they can then compile the data that they've obtained through their measurements and publish it to the public so that they can address any areas of weakness that they need to. And with that, the last point, they talk about facilitating the development and availability of affordable means of health promotion, disease prevention, and treatment. So while I'm not officially with Healthy People 2030, I'm really utilizing that third goal or third method there as far as allowing access to health promotion and getting information out there about Healthy People 2030 and ways that we can become healthier as a society. And building off that method, that aspect that we just talked about, this is my what, how, and why. So my primary goal of my presentation was to decrease the sugar intake of adolescents, with the secondary goal being the reduction of the risk of diabetes and childhood obesity. We'll get to both those things here soon. And in doing so, I decided that I thought that it would be more beneficial to speak with the parents and guardians of the adolescents rather than the adolescents alone. There's a couple different reasons that I chose that. One being that a lot of times adolescents' diets are somewhat controlled by their parents and their guardians, just because you're the ones doing the grocery shopping and that kind of stuff, as well as some topics that we'll get to later when I talk about ways in which you can get involved and help me out with my public health initiative of decreasing sugar intake in adolescents. And most importantly, the why of why I chose this topic, which is obesity and childhood diabetes rates have continued to raise in the U.S. They're at all-time highs, and that's really not great. Both of the diseases of diabetes and obesity are pandemics in this country, and they really lead to a lot of long-term health effects and decrease the quality of life of the kids that are affected by these diseases. So I think that it's really important in order to spread awareness for both of these diseases, as well as how we can get involved in decreasing their rates. It is important to note that both diabetes and obesity are multifactorial diseases. There's a lot of things that go into it. Certainly sugar is not the end-all be-all of both diseases. However, and we'll get further into it, a lot of the research says that decreasing the sugar intake will help to decrease both of these risks and hopefully in the long term decrease the rates of childhood obesity and diabetes. All right, so let's get down to it. The first thing that I wanted to do was talk about one of the studies that's a longitudinal study that was taken starting in about 2000, and they took the data over those 20 years until about 2020 about the rates of diabetes within adolescent population, as well as looking at the complications and how the disease itself affects the kids that are diagnosed with diabetes. So this was an organization that conducted studies across the country. They actually did it in 5 different states, not including Florida, unfortunately, but they did spread across the country just so that they were able to get good data from a variety of different populations and states. So like I said, they were just kind of looking at the rates of diabetes among children and young adults, as well as complications and how it affects their lives. Their research was funded by the CDC and the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive, and Kidney Diseases. I kind of looked into it. I don't really think there's bias behind their studies based on who is funding it, but funding can always play a role in that. So on the next slide, we'll kind of get to some information that came out from the search study for diabetes in youth and what they found. All right, so one of the studies that they were able to actually publish from this large research project looked at the trend of diabetes in the 10 to 19-year-olds. So pretty close to the population age that I chose at 12 to 17. It's a little bit broader, but for the sake of this, it fits pretty closely and I believe is generalizable to the population of 12 to 17-year-olds. So what they found is they were looking at the rates of both diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2 is that in 2001, there were 588 cases in 1.73 million children. In 2009, that increased to 814 in 1.85 million. And then in 2017, it was 1,230 cases in 1.85 million. So I did notice that they changed from 1.73 million to 1.85 million children between 2001 and then 2009. So rather than have there be any skepticism of the increase of cases be due to the increased population, we went ahead and broke it down into the amount of cases per 1,000 kids. So you can see that there, and that helps to standardize it so that we can see how many kids per 1,000 rather than trying to estimate it based on that larger population. So there's still a substantial increase from 0.34 per 1,000 kids in 2001 all the way to 0.67 in 2017. So with that, it said they claimed that in all 6 areas of the U.S. that they studied, I know last slide I said 5. So for this study, they actually took information from kids in North Carolina as well. Search didn't have their own research center there, but the CDC, since they were funding, also collected data for them in North Carolina, where the CDC is headed. So they did 6 areas in the U.S. rather than the 5 states that the search actually has bases in. They found that both type 1 and type 2 diabetes rates increased over the 16-year period. Obviously, type 1 has other even more components to it than type 2, as it's usually genetic. But it's important to note that type 2 diabetes did increase in that population during those 16 years, which is the type that I kind of more focused on for my project. So moving on from diabetes and that search information on the last slide, which is a really good study, and the citation for that is in the back if you want to visit their website or read the study yourself. I want to move on to obesity real quick and give some stats about that. So we're going to start, all three of these graphics are from 3 different sources because I was trying to get a good overall picture about the history of obesity in our country and trying to make sure that the information that I provided to you guys was valid. So I'm going to start in the bottom left picture. This says children ages 10 to 17. So this is actually from a website called stateofchildhoodobesity.org, and they allow it so you can see different stats and different categories of stats for the nation, but also each state. So this number, the 15.8% for obesity rate, is actually for Florida alone. So nearly 16% of kids 10 to 17 years old are obese in the state of Florida right now, which is pretty crazy to think about. You can see there it also says that Florida ranked 22nd out of 51 states. So they included, I believe, Puerto Rico in this graphic. So that means that although 21 states actually have higher obesity rates, Florida is still in that top 50%, and there's 29 states that have lower obesity rates in the U.S. So we can definitely improve upon this number. Moving on to the graphic there in the upper left, this actually came from the CDC. So they were able to compile information all the way from 1963 up until 2018 when they published this graphic on their website. So I'm kind of focusing on that light green mint colored line there because that's the line for 12 to 19 years old, which matches our population pretty closely. So you can see when they started tracking that population in 1966 that the obesity rate was actually below 5%. So less than 5 kids in every 100 kids was obese back in 1966. It did take a slight downward trend in the 1970s before it started to skyrocket there all the way until present day. So now if you look at it, the obesity rate in the U.S. as a population for 12 to 19-year-olds is over 20% of children. That's crazy. The good news is for Florida, the national is actually a little bit higher. However, that doesn't mean we can't improve that number, 1 for the country, but 2 for Florida, and help our kids down here in Florida to become healthier and avoid childhood obesity. Moving on to that next picture there on the right, that actually was published in a study in which they looked at the sugar intake and obesity prevalence. So they were actually aimed at trying to relate sugar intake to obesity, moving all the way from the 1970s to the 2010s. So this bottom line that starts at the 0.03 that you can see, that is the obesity line. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but again, you can see similarly to that CDC graphic that it was right around 5% in the 1970s before taking a sharp upturn. It kind of collides with that other line there, but it's the one that continues up at the 0.13. So even in the 2000s and 2010s, we were still seeing childhood obesity rates increasing. It's a little bit lower right there around 17%, and that's kind of hard to compile to everybody because they're not taking stats from 100%. It's estimations, but it is still significant. If we look at the other line that starts at the 0.26 there, that's the sugar consumption for children at that time. And you can see it takes a sharp upturn in the 1990s before kind of plateauing and actually decreasing in between 2000 and 2010. What that tells me is that even though childhood obesity is still increasing, we are actually having success in bringing the problem of sugar to light and actually helping to cut some sugar out of our daily consumption. As I kind of mentioned before, obesity is multifactorial. There's a lot of things that play into it. Sugar certainly is not 100% of the problem, and I'm not trying to say that it is, but that if we can continue that downward trend of total sugar intake, that it might help to decrease or even at least slow the obesity increase prevalence rate in the coming years. So even there in the 2010s, you can see with the obesity prevalence that kids were consuming just under 95 grams of sugar a day. I know we haven't gotten to the recommendations for sugar intake yet, but that's pretty significant. It's almost double the recommended intake. So I just wanted to give you guys some stats on the obesity rates as we continue. One last slide talking about some of the stats about the prevalence of the sugar intake, specifically in sugar sweetened beverages, such as soda, teas, lemonades, that kind of stuff. The information on the left side of the screen, the words, is actually from a study published in a journal called Obesity Reviews. This study says that there's sufficient data that decreasing sugar sweetened beverage intake actually can decrease dietary complications such as diabetes and obesity. So the study found that higher intake of the sugar sweetened beverages among children was associated with a 55% higher risk of being obese or overweight, and that daily intake of these beverages actually has a 26% greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes rather than those who only occasionally drink these beverages. And that lastly, like I said, they kind of just found that the evidence that decreasing the intake of sugar-sweetened beverages will decrease the risk of obesity and related diseases such as type 2 diabetes. The graphic on the right side actually came from that website, the State of Childhood Obesity again, and it shows that the stats on who actually consumes one or more cans, bottles, or glasses of soda daily. And for the US as a whole, it was 15.1% of high schoolers and kids in our target population of that 12 to 17 years old. So that's quite significant, but that's enough for stats. So let's get down to the recommendations of sugar intake from the FDA. So the FDA recommends that less than 10% of a child's calories should come from sugar. What that means is if we're looking at our standard 2,000 calorie diet for each day, it translates to just under 50 grams of sugar per day. And again, that's the FDA's recommendation. However, the American Heart Association actually takes a stricter stance on sugar intake and says that children in this target population of 12 to 17 should be consuming less than 25 grams of sugar per day. I was unable to find any data more recent than what I kind of shared 2 slides ago in the graphic about sugar intake within children. However, a study published in the Polish Journal of Food and Nutrition actually found that based on studies completed in the US that the average American actually consumes close to 300% of the daily recommended sugar intake from the FDA. So if you do the math, that comes out to 150 grams per day. Again, this isn't specific to the population of adolescents, but it is significant. And it shines a light on a bigger problem that we need to start earlier with sugar intake and healthier diets for kids. So next here on the right column, this data is actually published by the University of California, San Francisco on their website about sugar science. So they claim that there's 61 names for sugar in packaged foods that is able to be used on nutrition labels. And they did a study based on the packaged foods found commonly in grocery stores and found that nearly 75% of those foods contained added sugar. So real quick, I just wanted to go over some of those 61 names that are some of the most commonly used. The first one's agave nectar, then cane sugar. Cane sugar is important to note because a lot of foods will actually label it as natural sugar. But even though it is natural, it's not as processed as corn syrup or anything like that. It is still sugar, so we still need to monitor it and use moderation in our consumption of cane sugar. Next is corn syrup. Everybody kind of knows about corn syrup and high fructose corn syrup. The next ones are dextrose, fructose, maltose, and sucrose. Without getting heavily into chemistry, those are just different molecules that are sugar-based, and they're all considered sugars. So again, we need to watch out for those on our packaged foods. And then the last two are molasses and syrup. Both of those, again, can be more natural, such as like natural maple syrup, but they're still sugar and they have high sugar content, and we need to monitor them in our daily intake. All right, so I just threw a lot of stats and numbers at you. And if you're anything like I am, then you learn a little bit better from visualization and less so just me talking to you. So what I did is I went out, I got 6 drinks, 5 of which are pretty common within the adolescent population. I drank them a lot growing up. I know teens still do. And then 1 is apple juice. Apple juice might not be so relevant as much in the 12 to 17 years group, but it still is, and there's an important point that I wanted to discuss with apple juice as well as a overall in the scope of this lecture. So basically I went out, I got those 6 drinks, I bought some sugar cubes. Each sugar cube is about 3 grams of sugar. So I looked at the grams of sugar in each drink, made the little things with sugar cubes, and then we're going to go through them. Something that I did want to point out too, though, is that each drink is different size. So the apple juice is 8 ounces, whereas the Arizona tea is 23 ounces. So what I did is I did the calculation as well to break it down into grams of sugar per ounce of that drink so that we can also discuss that a little bit. So just starting off randomly, I have a bottle of lemonade. It's a 12-ounce bottle of lemonade. The nice thing about this is they say they don't put any like corn syrup in it, but still it has 28 grams of sugar. So in 12 ounces, we have 28 grams of sugar, which comes out to 9.33 cubes. If we remember back to our CDC recommendations for adolescents, we're only looking at 50 grams of sugar a day. So this 1 bottle of lemonade would be more than half of the sugar that an adolescent should have max in 1 day. So then moving on, we're gonna do a Red Bull. I got a 16-ounce Red Bull just because I wanted to go with the bigger size because they come in 8, 12, and 16. So in the 16-ounce, we have 50 grams of sugar. That would be the daily limit for your child if they were to drink a Red Bull. And again, that's the 16-ounce Red Bull. It comes out to just under 17 sugar cubes, which is pretty crazy. And then that comes out to 3.125 grams per ounce. So just over a sugar cube per ounce of Red Bull. So every time they take that drink, they're getting a sugar cube basically in their system. The next is just an Arizona tea. I'd grabbed the green tea with ginseng just because it was what I saw. And that comes out to 49 grams. So it's a 23-ounce can, a little bit bigger than that Red Bull, with only 1 gram less of sugar. So it comes out to just over 2 grams of sugar per ounce. So a little bit less per ounce than the Red Bull, but still it's only 1 gram less than their daily intake. So it's pretty significant. Next, especially big in the athlete community, would be Gatorade. So for the Gatorade, this is just a standard 20-ounce Gatorade, fruit punch flavor. And that comes out to 34 grams of sugar. So for Gatorade, it's just over 11 sugar cubes for a 20-ounce bottle of Gatorade. Interestingly enough, that comes out to 1.7 grams of sugar per ounce, which surprisingly to me was the least amount of sugar per ounce. With that though, we're still looking at 34 grams of sugar, something to be aware of. And we can talk about some techniques that I tell both family members and patients in clinicals right now that I use with Gatorade, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the lecture. Next, I wanted to talk about the apple juice. So an apple juice at 8 ounces, pretty small amount, came out to 28 grams of sugar, which is a little bit over 9 cubes of sugar. With that, per ounce is 3.5 grams, so a little bit more than a sugar cube per ounce of apple juice. And I think that that's something important to talk about as well, because we always want to look at fruits and vegetables always being healthy, but it's important to recognize that fruit juices, while this one says that it's 100% juice, also still contains a lot of sugar, and it's natural sugars in our apples, but it's always good to be aware that it's better to eat an apple than to drink the apple juice. And similarly with the Gatorade, I have a technique that we'll talk about here later in the lecture about how you can kind of cut down on that sugar, especially if your kids really love apple juice and Gatorade, and that way they're not getting so much sugar, but they can still drink what they want to drink. And then lastly, I saved the Dr. Pepper. This is just a standard 20-ounce bottle of Dr. Pepper. However, 65 grams of sugar in this Dr. Pepper. That is crazy. It came out to almost 21 cubes of sugar. So there's this much sugar in one bottle of Dr. Pepper. And that came out to a little bit over 3 grams of sugar per ounce as well. So again, you're getting one of those sugar cubes every time you drink an ounce of Dr. Pepper, which is pretty crazy. I don't think people always understand or realize that there's that much sugar in these drinks. With that being said, again, the Gatorade had the least amount of sugar per ounce at 1.7, and the apple juice, again, had 3.5, which is kind of weird to think about, but again, they're natural sugars. This particular juice actually has no added sugar. It's all just straight from the apple juice, which is a very sugary fruit anyways. But for the most part, they ranged right around 1 sugar cube per ounce, which when you think about it and you really look at the size of the sugar cubes, and it's pretty significant. So I know I threw a lot of numbers at you again, but I thought it was important to see the sugar cubes next to the drink. On the next slide, I'm going to go ahead and put the chart that I just kind of read off to you guys with the grams, how many sugar cubes that is, and how many grams of sugar per ounce that is, as well as a picture with all of the drinks and their sugar cube amounts together. That way you can go ahead and pause the video, look at it as long as you want, and it'll really give you a good view of how much sugar is truly in these drinks and how they kind of compare to each other. Of all the drinks that I got, let me double check. Yeah, of all the drinks that I got, the only one that doesn't say it's 1 serving size is the Arizona tea. They put it at 2, but otherwise this is it's a lot of sugar in these drinks that our kids are consuming. And I mean, let's be honest, us as well. I'm guilty of it. I'll have a Gatorade or a Dr. Pepper every once in a while. But it's something that we should definitely be aware of so that we can work on these changes, because we don't want to get closer to the endpoints that we talked about of diabetes and obesity for both our adolescents and ourselves. So like I said, on the next slide, we'll see that chart and those pictures. So you're welcome to go ahead and pause the video here if you'd like. This slide's a little bit more for just those who wanted a little bit more of a visual as far as the breakdown of everything. So there's the table that I was talking about that I made, compiling all of the data from the drinks that I chose, as well as the picture of all of the drinks together. So if you want, go ahead and pause here, and when you're ready, you can go ahead and continue the video. All right, so let's get down to the important part of how can we actually help our adolescents to decrease their sugar intake and keep their risk away from the obesity and diabetes. So I kind of just pulled some of these ideas from some blogs about healthy eating, and I'll try to put those links in the description below, make them even easier than having to sort through my citations here at the end so that you can get to them, because some of them are pretty good. So the first one is serving water or milk, especially with dinner. So a lot of people have juice or anything like that, Gatorades, that kind of stuff, but if we can, especially that water. Milk does have sugar, again, natural sugar, it's lactulose. However, it is still healthier than some of the alternatives of lemonade or juices. So that's a good place to start. Water would definitely be best, but milk is always healthy because we want to make sure that our kids have strong bones and are able to grow properly. The second is limiting fruit juice. So I know I've mentioned this multiple times, and I did in that activity. Fruit juice, although natural sugars from things such as our apple juice, and actually orange juice has a ton of added sugar in it to make it so that it's less sour and more able to be drank. So one of the things that I tell a lot of my patients too is cutting it. So what I mean by that is taking your apple juice and you actually dilute it with water. So you can still drink 8 ounces, or well, give your children 8 ounces of the juice, the Gatorade, anything like that. So they still get 8 ounces, but it's 4 ounces of water, 4 ounces of the juice of Gatorade. and that helps to cut the sugar intake as well, and makes it a little bit more dilute and can be a good way to cut that sugar intake. Next is the limiting of prepackaged and processed foods. Again, we kind of mentioned earlier that 75% of prepackaged foods actually have added sugar. With that, there's certainly prepackaged foods that don't contain sugar or have very low sugar content. So one of my recommendations is also learning how to read nutrition labels. I unfortunately don't really have time to get into that today. However, there's a lot of really good resources on how to read nutrition labels, as well as following up with that website that I told you about, which is Sugar Science from the University of California, San Francisco, and just becoming familiar with the names that they might use for the sugars. The next one would be cooking more meals at home. This kind of goes hand in hand with the limiting prepackaged and processed foods. So if we're cooking a lot of healthy foods, vegetables, anything like that that's not previously packaged, then we're going to have lower sugar intake or content in those foods, and that'll in turn decrease our sugar intake. With that too, a lot of fast food places add sugar. Again, for taste, they try to make their food taste as good as possible. So kids get a lot of sugar intake from foods from fast food restaurants as well. So cooking at home is a great way to help limit your sugar intake and get them to eat healthier. And then the last one is increased vegetable intake. Again, getting their calories from a healthy source rather than the sugars and the prepackaged foods is huge. So kind of the overall arching thing is just being conscious about your sugar intake, finding ways to decrease it. It's certainly a hard thing to do, but you'll be healthier for it in the end and be thankful for it. So it's definitely something that's important. Taking it one step further, and kind of one of the reasons I mentioned earlier for why I wanted to speak with parents is getting involved in things such as parent-teacher associations or attending local school board meetings. So the American Association of Pediatrics has determined that kids consume somewhere between 35 and 50% of their daily calories at school. So unless you're finding a way to monitor that, or you send food with them every single day, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. With that, there was actually an act in 2010 called the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, which led to healthier options and better regulation of foods in school. But there's definitely still room for improvement because most schools still have vending machines with candies and pops and that kind of stuff. So like I said, getting involved in parent-teacher associations or going to local school board meetings, you can be the grassroots that kind of get movements started in order to get healthier foods into schools, that kind of stuff, because they definitely provide an outlet so that you can have a voice. And this way you're going beyond just limiting sugar within your household, but helping to change the environment within your child's life so that they hopefully are able to make those healthier choices and decrease sugar intake. So as it turns out, trying to get involved in PTA and that sort of thing is not actually the hard part about this project. The hard part is that a study published in 2019 in the American Journal of Health Promotion actually found that adolescents were more likely to consume a sugar-sweetened beverage every day if their parents did as well. So even though I kind of geared my project towards adolescents based on Healthy People 2030, at the end of the day, I'm also asking for your help as parents to make changes in your life as well, because it's going to have a lasting impact on the adolescents and helping to decrease their sugar intake. So like I said, this kind of means that the change starts with you. And the study that I'm referencing says that in order to start changing the attitude surrounding sugar-sweetened beverages, efforts to improve adult dietary habits is important. So with that, though, the study also doesn't fail to mention that in order to help in adolescent behavior changes, it's not all on you. So don't think it's all on you. However, you do play an important role. The study doesn't fail to recognize that changing the attitudes of adolescents towards sugar-sweetened beverages is also important. So it kind of is a multifactorial thing, which kind of seems to be a theme of tonight as far as the diabetes and obesity, and now how we're going to help decrease sugar. So it is important and will help if you can kind of decrease your sugar intake as well if you consume sugar sweetened beverages. However, it's also important that we start changing the attitude around these and the attitude of the children around these beverages. So that one's a little bit trickier and it's personality based, so we can't really get into it. As I mentioned in the beginning of the PowerPoint, I'd recommend speaking with your PCP, and they kind of help you in these changes as well as needed. So one last thing before I try to wrap this up real quick. I don't want to drone on for too long. As I mentioned on this last slide, changing behaviors is actually really hard. However, a book I recently read called The Power of Habit is fantastic. I would recommend you read it. It talks about how we can change habits and how habits run our life, and through certain ways we can actually change habits, build new ones for a healthier lifestyle. So real quick, one of his main points is that there's 3 points to every habit. There's the cue, the routine, and the reward. So in this graphic on the right, the cue is the time, the routine is walking towards the cafeteria because the cue is met, which is the time. So at a certain time every day they walk to the cafeteria, and the reward, I don't know why it's not getting food or whatever they get at the cafeteria, but in this example it's being able to talk to their coworkers. They walk to the cafeteria and you rinse and repeat. So the book focuses on how you can identify these cues and change your routines and your rewards, and it's really a great book. It's pretty cheap and I would strongly recommend reading it. I thoroughly enjoyed it when I read it, and I've actually utilized some of the points in the book in order to get myself to start eating healthier and going to the gym and that kind of stuff. So it might be worth something to check out if you're committed to making these changes in your life, in your adolescence life. All right, so at the risk of sounding like a broken record, one last slide of recap about the most important points. So first of all, both type 2 diabetes and obesity appear to have a link to overconsumption of sugar in the diet of adolescents, and diabetes and obesity rates continue to rise in the adolescent population. Again, both of these diseases are multifactorial, so sugar certainly isn't the only thing contributing to these increases, but it's certainly a good spot that's easy enough to change and to help decrease the risk of these two diseases for our kids. Also, the processed foods contain 75% of them contain added sugars, so making sure that we're buying fresh foods and cooking at home are two great ways in order to avoid over-consuming our sugar and eating healthier. And lastly, remember, you can be the change. So adolescents are less likely to overconsume the sugar-sweetened beverages when their parents and guardians don't consume them either. And then getting involved in your local PTA meetings or attending school board meetings are a great way to make a healthy impact on your community. So these are just some of the most important points. Hopefully you learned a lot and enjoyed it. So I just wanted to do one last recap. All right, and that brings us to the end. So here's my post-presentation survey. If you could fill it out real quick, it'll only take you 2 minutes. It would help me tremendously for my capstone. Hopefully you enjoyed the lecture, and thank you so much for watching it. So until next time, hopefully I taught you something. Take care.